Hi, my name is David Hitchcock and I teach 401 here, Live Sound at Avant Media Institute. And today we're going to be talking about how to have a better sound check, as well as how to have a better post-production experience. So here are some basic tips to get you started on setup. Number one, the band's call time is not your call time. You want to get to the venue even earlier because there are certain things that you want to have already in line before the artist ever sets foot in that door. One of the main things you want to do is tune the room. Now, when I talk about tuning the room, what do I mean? Let's get our sound system set up, powered, and running signal through it. Following that, you're going to want to pick a song that is well produced, that you're familiar with. Now, it's advantageous if that song is of the same genre as the performers of that night, but it doesn't actually have to be. Listen to that song in the room and listen critically. This is where you can hear the room's frequencies and which things might be getting in the way. If the room is creating resonance at 1K that isn't normally that loud, and you're listening to a track where you can hear that, it gets you off to a good head start on cleaning up the sound in the room. Head over to your master fader, pop an EQ on it, and remove that resonant frequency until it sounds like it should. Following that, you're going to want to ring out the mics on stage. Now, we cover ringing out mics more deeply in another video, but suffice it to say, you want to turn the gain up until you start hearing feedback, find that frequency that the mic is feeding back at, and notch it out. Once you've gotten those things done, the next thing you can do is listen to sound in different spots of the room. You can do this by walking around the room. Now, some boards you use will have an iPad you can wander the room with. This is extremely handy because then you can go make EQ moves in the room as you're experiencing them. Otherwise, you'll have to lead the board and make notes as to how the sound is happening in different parts of the room, since it won't be happening evenly throughout. One important note to remember, changing the sound in one part of the room does change the sound in every part of the room. So, if you get to that back corner where the sound is trash and you make a bunch of moves to make it sound perfect in that corner, you've also made a lot of moves in the main part of the room where most of your listeners will be standing. We want to get live sound as perfect as possible, but it is more important to make sure everybody is having a good experience and, barring that, having the greatest amount of your listeners having a good experience. So be careful which parts of your room you're ringing out to perfect sound. Now, the last bit that you're going to do before the artist arrives is to set up what you can. Now, in a perfect world, every artist that you have will have provided a tech writer and a stage plot. If you get those things, that's wonderful. Then you know exactly which mics you're setting up and where the DI box is going to go, and so on. A few things you can do ahead of time are still to get your drum mics run and placed on stands. Just have them out of the way for the drum kit to be able to move in when it arrives. And you can have at least one vocal mic, if not more, set up at the front of the stage. One last note for the bands, don't expect them to be on time. There are a lot of things that can happen that are actually out of anybody's control that still make it not a great practice to rely on the artist being on time. Now, let's talk about customer service. You have 3 customers to consider in any live sound gig. Your first customer to consider is the venue. They're the ones that are likely paying you, or at the very least, the artist that brought you on. Your second customer is, of course, the audience. And your third and final customer is the artist. Now, why in that order? Actually, the artist is the most important of these customers, because if your artist can hear themselves, they're happy, and you've created a good vibe in the room, they're going to put on a better show. If they put on a better show, then the audience, assuming the audience can hear them well and it's been mixed well, is going to have a better time. The audience has a better time, the venue makes more profit, they're going to have more returning customers, people are going to all around give better reviews and have more fun. Make sure that you take care of your artists. Their experience affects everybody else's experience the most. Now, a big part of this customer service we're talking about is how you communicate with the band. Of course, you want to make sure that the band can hear themselves well and that you are friendly, courteous, and professional during sound check. Make sure that you show up confident, knowing how to present yourself, but don't be overbearing, don't be too harsh. These are the things that give sound engineers a bad name, and they do affect the experience of the band. This doesn't mean that you have to listen to every suggestion the band makes. It is your room to get good sound in, and you are in charge of that. But you can do that in a way that is customer service oriented. A couple of tips for that would be learn the names of each of the band members. Build some relationship with them, some rapport. Ask them what else they're doing. Ask them where they're coming from. Just a little bit of lingo as you work. You might be setting up cables, you might be taping things down, you might be applying mics to drums. And unless that requires your full concentration, you ought to be conversing with the band. The exception to this rule, of course, is if they seem like they don't want to. All of the basic rules of customer service that you would normally think of when you're talking to friends or family. Pay attention to who you're speaking to and make sure that you communicate well. Which brings us into the second aspect of that customer service. Communicate specifically what you're looking for and why. There will be artists that are going to have monitor mixes that you hate. That will exist. At that point, you can communicate to the artist, hey, I am giving your monitor as much as it can possibly get. We can hear this in the room without the mains. I'm sorry that you're not noticing it, but at this point, this is literally all I can give you. Would you like to come up with an alternative solution, perhaps in-ear monitors? Now that example there does assume you have in-ear monitors on hand to deliver to artists, and that may not always be the case. Either way, when you draw boundaries, still draw them in a friendly manner and communicate to the artist exactly why. It doesn't mean you have to explain every single step of the way, but you can communicate to them briefly why you're making the choices you're making and those limits. Now, this communication can happen on as broad of a spectrum as a venue. If you are in a small venue that is a little more than a closet with a couple of speakers in it, then of course, the standard for excellence and what you need to deliver is going to be significantly different than if you are, say, in a stadium. At any rate, your customer service with the band should be friendly but intentional. Let's talk about the differences and similarities between sound engineering for an artist that you're touring with versus sound engineering for a venue that you're a resident at. The main distinction, of course, is that when you're a resident sound engineer, you're going to be getting different artists every time, but the venue remains the same. Of course, on the flip side of that, if you're a touring engineer, then it's for the same artist or set of artists every time. However, your venue is going to change. My main experience is as a resident sound engineer. So touring engineers, if you have more to comment, please let us know. I do know this about being a touring engineer. You're in a different venue every time, which means the way that you're going to ring out the room, the way that you're going to mix each instrument, the way the very acoustics of the room respond are going to be wildly different from night to night. What is going to remain the same? The instrumentalists and the vocalists, or multiple vocalists. Their delivery, their general range, the tones of their instruments, all of these things are going to have a much more limited range of difference than if you're at a venue that you're the resident engineer at. When you're touring with an artist, the main distinctions you're going to find are going to be the sound systems of the venue, as well as the mics available to you. On the other side of that, as a residential engineer, you're in the same room every time. In fact, you can have that room EQ'd on the board on the master channel and saved as a preset. It's going to respond more or less the same way. The main difference then, of course, are the artists that come through. They're going to be a different number of instrumentalists per artist. They're going to be using different rigs. The vocalists are all going to be different. And at that point, your communication with various artists is going to be very, very important. Either way, you are still providing customer service, and either way, the speed of sound is only a constant at the same height above sea level, the same barometric pressure, the same air temperature. This means that whether you have a preset saved on a board you're bringing with you for an artist, or you have presets saved for artists that are returning to your venue that you've mixed before, these are just starting points. You will still need to pay attention to how the room is responding in that day. You just get to have a head start. So now, let's talk about the value of miking versus DI. When you're sound checking, you do have to consider what else is being played on stage. Let's use an acoustic guitar, for example. When miking an acoustic guitar or other acoustic instrument, you have a couple of limitations. The first disadvantage is that that performer will need to remain relatively still on stage. If you set up a mic on an acoustic guitar, but the guitarist wants to move around a lot, they could risk hitting the mic. And certainly that back and forth will affect the kind of sound coming through that mic, both by volume and by EQ spectrum. This is also true of any other performer that you mic, but with an acoustic in particular, if that is the sole performer, these things could be well heard. Another disadvantage, of course, is that the performer can't run around stage. Now, certain performers, you're not as concerned about that. If you think of a wide-scale production with a string section, or a chorus of singers, then of course they don't need to run around. However, if you're talking about an acoustic performer with a band, you may well want them to run around. Imagine hip-hop violin star Lindsey Sterling having to stand in front of a mic for her whole set. It wouldn't work, right? So let's talk about DI. The main advantage of DI is that it lets the artist move around. The artist can run around stage. Not only that, it's going to be consistent signal wherever they're standing. Now, DI assumes that they have a DI kit in their instrument, which isn't always the case, at which point you do need to mic it. The other part of DI that is advantageous is you get a bright, punchy signal. Now, maybe that's not what you're going for. If you want that classic acoustic sound, then maybe miking the acoustic is for the best. But then you need to move your stage around that, because that sounds like it's the point of the experience for the listener. If that isn't the point for the listener, and it's available, I strongly recommend going with DI systems. Next, we're going to talk about some tips to prepare for post-production if you're recording your live set. Many of these tips are actually going to be fundamental things you would do anyways, but they become ever more important if people are going to hear it again. This may sound obvious, but the first thing that you need to do for live recording is to double check your mics. Because with the live recording, you don't get a redo. You can't re-record. So line check, gain stage, and make sure you have everything mic'd that you want to be mic'd. Another thing to consider with your microphones is feedback will make it on the recording. You want phenomenal tone for your recording, but what you can't delete is feedback. Where you place a mic against the drum or where you place a mic against a guitar cabinet matters. For certain instruments, DI will truly be your best friend for recording. When talking about recording a live set, of course, you must also consider your gain staging. Clipping also gets recorded if it's come in through the preamp of your board. That happens before any recording, so make sure that your levels are set properly for your preamps, your gain knobs. Following that, let's discuss the use of gates. Now, live, we may well decide to use a gate with a really low threshold just to help keep feedback loops from starting on their own. Every now and again, I've had a kick drum mic start a low hum feedback loop when left without a gate. It of course depends on the venue, the room, and several other factors, but there are reasons to use a gate to avoid those things. When we're talking about post-production, I shy away from gates entirely. The fact is, microphones are going to have stage bleed no matter where they are. If you gate that stage bleed in and out with the performance, that's going to be a significant difference in volume when those things pop in, especially vocals. So instead, hand edit and automate your volume. This is the best way to go about it. If you do have to use a gate for the sake of time, make sure you're not overusing the gate. It's better to listen through and still go in and hand edit and fade certain elements than to have things get cut out that you weren't even paying attention to. Be very careful with how you use gates. And that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Once again, my name is David Hitchcock with Avant Media Institute. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website at avantmediainstitute.com. And if you think I missed anything, please leave a note in the comments.